Hi there. So, I just went for a walk and ate, and it feels so very late. Um, but what to say about the rest of my friendship with Leo? I'm not his biographer. I don't know the full scope of his life. But I can share how I felt and occurrences I can remember. So as I was saying when I met him in my little introduction, that I met him when I'd just come off of heartbreak. I was really in love with someone and thought, wow, maybe someday I'll have a boyfriend. And he was astrologically a Leo, and I left to have a little adventure. It seemed very synchronistic. Somebody offered to take me to Sedona, and my boyfriend at the time was disappearing on me. While I was away, I realized, I was like, wow, you told me you wanted to know everything to make your dreams come true. Because I kept seeing, he would talk about things he wanted, and then I would see all these things he was doing that would keep him from ever having the dreams come true. So I said, do you want me to tell you when I see those things? And he said, yeah. But when I did that, he just started disappearing. Now, I was too young and not probably compassionate enough at understanding humanity. I was 21, right? So I met Leo when I was 22, coming off this weird heartbreak where this guy had said that he wanted like full honesty and full presence, and he didn't. And still, it was the best sex I ever had in my life, and probably the first time I was ever fully in love. It was the first time I ever tried to live with somebody. And for 2 years afterwards, every time I had sex with anyone else, I was like, well, that was nice, but it's not Robert. It was nice, but it's not Robert. And it would have been very difficult for me to stay with him, but it would have been continuity. And I don't know, he was an artist. I've always been very attracted to artists and spiritual people. So then I meet Leo. After I'd made this declaration that I would never fall in love with a Leo again, I meant astrologically, and the next person I fall in love with is named Leo. Ha 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 ha. But he thought he was a Gemini, and I looked him up in my astral. I'd started doing a lot of astrological charts at that point in my life, and I looked him up, and he was actually 29 and 59 minutes Taurus. And I was like, oh, you're so much more Taurus. Cancer rising. Oh, but Gemini moon. Okay, I get that. Mars conjunct Venus, the beginning of Gemini. Or no, Taurus, beginning of Taurus. Difficult. Anyway. It started off with this just really nice, sensual, hedonist friendship thing. And there was no sense of falling in love. But after 9/11, after I cut my hair off and traveled around Mongolia, after he went on sabbatical and spent 4 months in Europe, and I went for the last 2 weeks and traveled around with him, and he showed me, I guess, the beauty of how he loved the world. And I don't mean how you love the world in some idealistic way, but how you love the world in action. I mean, how do you engage with the world as a lover? How do you act as a lover of the world? After he showed me how he loved the world, the way he ate, and had sex, and went to church, and looked at art, went to museums, went to cities, the way he soaked it up, the knowledge he had, the perception. Then when he left, all of a sudden the world was pointless without him, in that way that love and obsession can be. And I remember he had said something to me about the Moody Blues song, Nights in White Satin. He said he liked it or something, and this happened many times throughout our relationship, where he would reference some song, and then I would start listening to it, and I would tie it with him, and get totally obsessed over it. But boots of Spanish leather, and we'll sing in the sunshine and ascend in the clouds. Anyway, Nights in White Satin, which is a song everyone's heard a billion times. I grew up hearing it on the radio. I heard it a billion times, but I never connected with it. But after he left, I listened to it over and over and over again, and it was like the song is so mournful and dramatic about being in love and how it kind of like is the most supreme agony to be in love with someone in a way that makes life pointless if you're not with them. And I was like, wow, that's the way I feel about Leo now. So then I spent a year traveling around Europe, being aware that I was kind of falling in love with everybody I was meeting, but in a different way, and kind of constantly wanting Leo. And although I had planned to not come back to America for 5 years, one of my good friends came to Europe and surprised me, and we traveled around. He was a friend my own age. And then he went back to America and found out his father was dying, so he asked me if I would come back and help him with his father dying. So I went back to America to help him with his father dying. And Leo met me at the airport, and I was just so happy to see him. I was like, oh, I love you so much. But all of our early many years of friendship were distant. I would visit him, he would visit me in the mountains. We would spend a little bit of time together. It always felt like a celebration to see each other. That's why I felt like he was always drinking 3 bottles of wine, because it was a celebration. And he would say that, oh, I don't drink like this regularly, but because you're here. And I have these memories. We'd always light a fire, so it was always like sleeping on a bed naked in front of a fireplace, this big, beautiful fireplace. I remember us sleeping out on the deck. Jose, you're commenting on I'm not being stuck on someone right now. I'm telling a story about a friend of mine who's died. It's not like my life is stuck on him. I'm telling stories about him. So thank you for your platitudes. Anyway, I remember that even though so much of our friendship was hedonistic and sensual, it wasn't that wasn't like the main deal of it. Like the sex between us wasn't that big of a deal for me. The cuddling, the sensuality, the physical way in which we occupied space together was really special to me. I mean, I remember nights of he had this log cabin up in the mountains, and it was about 3,000 feet in Northern California, and there were farmlands below and forests and stuff. I remember that in the summer, one summer, I don't remember which summer it was, we put the bed out on the deck, on the upper deck, and would sleep, with this big, huge, I think it was a cedar tree, blowing over us, and just watch the stars. Because in Northern California, it doesn't really rain in the summer. It only rains in the winter, season by seasonal like that. And it was just so amazing to go to sleep with a friend every night, where we'd cuddle up and stare at the stars, and go to sleep staring at the stars, or go to sleep staring at the fire. I guess that's something that, choosing to leave the cities, you can have. You can't really have that in the cities. And he was like a city person who chose to go to another city and then chose to leave the city. I'm kind of a country person who always wanted to live in the city, and I live in the city now, and I'm like, oh, this is nice. I kind of miss the country. Kind of thing. The difficulty of living in the country, though, is you have to be really at peace with yourself and satisfied with who you're with. And I was talking, I think in the little last segment, about his relationship with alcohol, which I guess when I met him seemed really normal. But after I got back from Europe, again, I was helping my friends with his family whose father died, and then Leah went to Europe again for some conference of the church, I think, and I stayed alone at his cabin again for another month. And then somebody gave me a van, and I drove across the country. I went to New York, and he visited me in New York, and we went and visited an old boyfriend of his in Buttsville, New Jersey, and went and visited his brother in Connecticut. his younger brother, and had a nice little adventure. I mean, just adventures. It was so nice to travel with him. Like, he was somebody that was so fun to travel with and so fun to talk to. In the times that I didn't, in the times that I was with him, we always had wonderful conversations. And I think one of the points that I always like to hit on that was so important for me is that I grew up Catholic, and it didn't make any sense to me. And when I hit my teenage years, I kind of became an atheist, but in a very angry way, which a lot of atheists are, very like evangelical, angry atheists. And sometimes it's a simmering, quiet anger, but it's usually very angry. And I remember as a teenager that even though I didn't believe in God, I hated him. Like, hated. It was hate. I mean, feel the heat in my heart. Hated God. Hate God. You know, so that's not a good way to live, really. God exists, you don't want to hate God. And if God doesn't exist, you don't want to hate God. That's a waste of time. So I had felt like I dealt with a lot of that, but it's still like anytime people brought up Christianity, I was like, this is stupid and hypocritical, and it's like retarded, whatever. So when I met him, and he was such a fucking Christian, but he'd been a Christian his whole life, and in a way that the average American Christian is not. I mean, he lived and breathed Christianity, but not in a weird, like, Bible-quoting, evangelical, talking about angels kind of way. He was totally not like that at all. He was completely grounded, and I would say to a certain extent, I mean, he wasn't intellectual. He was not an intellectual, he was not an academic, but he was very well versed. He was very well studied, and not, again, like he was quoting Bible, because he didn't, but he was always breaking down things etymologically and giving word history, which is like totally the language I speak. I was just that's something that has always been fascinating to me since I started reading, which I would always get dictionaries and look up the etymology and break. I didn't take Latin in school, but I took Spanish. I mean, that's kind of Latin light. And I loved being able to talk to him and feel very understood. Like, he was very interested in my life living process. And and this is obviously what priests and bartenders and masseurs and psychotherapists are exceptionally good at, is listening to people and making them feel listened to and understood. So he was really, really good at that. And so as a lover, it was wonderful because, again, he had really good boundaries. So he didn't get tangled up in my garbage. He didn't take it personally when I lashed out at him. And I'd never been with anyone like that. So I found it incredibly exciting to talk with him because I could go on my weird philosophical tangents. I mean, my whole 20s up until my Saturn return was all existentialism. I was constantly wrestling with existentialism. I wanted to understand what the hell we were doing in this existence, why humanity was repeating these cycles and never growing or changing. We're just, constant, endless cycles of abuse and exploitation, and it just seems to be getting bigger and worse. I didn't really have a lot of compassion. And, he wouldn't tell me the way to feel or the way to think. He would listen, and we would have conversations. They weren't even like argumentative debates that I can have with my Jewish friends, which is more their style. He set such an amazing example, I guess. I mean, and this is weird because I'm not a Christian, but he set such an amazing example of what I believe a Christian is or should be. I mean, even when I think of what a Christian should be, I'm like, wow, he set such a good example of what a Christian should be. I mean, and he did Mass twice a day. And I went to church with him a few times, but I hate church so much. Like, I hate it. If it's in a language I can understand, it just makes me feel really bad. Makes me feel like my soul's getting sucked out or my brain's getting collapsed. I don't know. I don't like the way it feels. So I'd sometimes go to church when he was doing Masses places, and I would just be like, ugh. And I tried to avoid it any chance I could get. And he always did Mass at his house twice a day, and I never went in there until he was dying. I never went in the church. I never went into his chapel with him doing Mass until he was dying. And when I did, I realized that our entire relationship, like, one of the things I'd always complained about was that, I didn't feel understood. I still complain about this, that I don't feel understood by people to my deepest self or something. And, when he was dying, I realized, wow, I didn't understand him in his deepest self, because the most important thing for him is Christianity. The most important thing for him is his religion and his spiritual practice. And I've always just kind of been like, I don't get it, so I'm just going to have sex with you and drink some wine, and we'd go to some bathhouses and whatever we did. We had a very, we'd go to the hot springs, go to whatever. And that was just kind of something he did that I just didn't spend time with. But similarly, I did yoga, and he didn't do yoga with me. I went walking naked in nature. He didn't really care about that. I went for hikes. He didn't really care about that. So, I mean, it just seemed like it was fine. But I felt so lonely because I didn't have someone that did those things with me that really nourished my soul. And when he was dying, I was like, oh, this is what nourishes his soul the most. And I have not been able to be a companion in that with him. And wouldn't that have been nice for him? Because one of the things he said all the time was, before he got sick, one of the things he said all the time was, oh, whenever it comes that it's time for me to die, I'll be ready, because I've lived a life that I've gotten to do everything I've wanted to do. I've had wonderful pleasures. I've seen amazing things. I've met amazing people. There's nothing I'm wanting for in life. And I really believe that's how he was experiencing life while he was living it. And it felt really good to be around someone who felt like they lived their life without regrets. And he really enjoyed it. He really enjoyed it. But when he was dying, he got bitter and angry, which he'd never been like that before he got sick with cancer. So, I was able to see some of his regrets, and it was almost like I was angry at him for having hidden them from me or hidden them from himself. Because it was clear to me that, when I heard more stories unfold, that it was clear that when he had tried to set up his cabin as a hermitage and he had tried to have different people stay there, and in the years I was living in New York, he had picked up some homeless guy walking along the freeway, hitchhiking, and he took him back to his house, and the guy lived with him for, I think, about 2 years. A guy named John. And John was just a really broken person. I was saying Leo liked broken biscuits, so John was just a really broken person. And I think even in that situation, like all the other broken people that he told me about that I'd never met, he had always hoped to somehow rehabilitate them. And it was very clear with John that that's what he was hoping, that he could somehow get him to not be a drunk, not be a meth addict. Because, Northern California is just so much drunks and meth addicts. And of course, most of a lot of the people on the hill were drunks and meth addicts. So John, of course, fell in with drunks and meth addicts, just being up there, and eventually stole stuff from Leo and disappeared after 2 years. Imagine. But I think, it was in seeing that Leo had a lot of people that had come up there who had, he had hoped for a companion in his spirituality. That I think he had with the Church of the Beloved Disciple in New York, and he'd never had again when he moved out west. And the Church of the Beloved Disciple in New York ended up folding because Clement and John, what's his name? Father Robert and Father John ended up leaving New York and going to live in LA. And then San Diego, when John died, Robert lived down there. But like Robert and John had that. They started a church. They had a very similar relationship with their spirituality, their Lord, their religion, whatever you want to call it. And I think that Leo would have liked that, to have had that. So even though he talked about living with no regrets, I felt like when he was dying that he did actually wished that he could have had that. And that I felt like I had not been aware of that. I was too self-absorbed or broken or whatever to have seen that, to have known. And obviously I'm just not the right person because I kind of have an allergy to Christianity. After when he started his dying process, when he started getting bitter and he was on methadone and he started nodding out all the time, and then he was in a lot of pain and prednisone and all these other, when that whole psychomedical pharmaceutical death process started, it became not so much fun to be around him, obviously. As the numbers of viewers dwindle when I start talking about it, yeah, people don't like facing that at all. Um, yeah, he got more bitter, and I was able to kind of like be like the allergy for Christianity came up again for me because I started feeling like he was just living in some terrible paradigm that was a trap. Because I still kind of think of Christianity as kind of like the Walmart of religions. You know, the Holy Roman Empire just kind of glomped everything together and said, "This is all about Jesus." Or the Easter Bunny, or Santa Claus, the day Jesus was born, totally, garbage. But Christianity, the social organizing governmental construct, is very different than the teachings of Christ, right? Everybody with any having researched it whatsoever would agree to that. Yeah, that was heartbreaking. But I don't know, get back to some stories. A whole smattering of positive little memories, like going to Harbin Hot Springs, and just again all the pleasurable. This we would do these little rituals. That Christmas was very important to him, and he had like beeswax German candles actual candles that we would put on the Christmas tree. I was like, oh, this is why someone's house always burns down at Christmas. We had to watch them very carefully, but we did little Christmas cards every year. He'd put on a little Santa hat, and he'd give me an elf hat. They weren't really Christmas cards, but I mean, we'd take pictures and email them to people and write up something really silly and nice. And like that was something for him. And then so I remember one year we did a solstice ritual, a winter solstice ritual for me, where we stayed up all night. I stayed up all night. He passed out. I stayed up all night tending the fire, because I remember reading something about some pagan solstice ritual whereby they lit the fire and you try to keep the fire going all night. And then when the sun rises, you know that you've made it through the longest night in the year, and the fires kept burning. And during those years, I remember I would read to him a lot. We got into reading to each other. I mostly read to him, but I introduced him to one of my favorite books called Little Big by John Crowley. And I read a lot of it to him. And it was really funny. He had a beautiful voice, I think, because he sang and he read all the time in his mass. So he didn't have a glorious singing voice, but he had such a cute, adorable singing voice, and just his spoken voice. So when he would read to me, I loved it, and I would read to him in front of the fire. I mean, imagine how nice that is, in a log cabin surrounded by books, wood walls, not painted, big fire, brick, bed right next to the fire, reading to each other. It was great. If not, sleeping out under the stars. So yeah, a lot of our relationship was distant and intermittent. But I came to really feel like his cabin was my home, because I was a traveler and I was constantly just moving. So I would go back and stay there, and it really felt like home to me. And he let me keep stuff there. So even though I was a traveler, I mostly had to give everything away all the time. I kept a lot of stuff at his cabin. The year that I went back after Europe, I had met this Hasidic Jewish guy in London who I believed what he said. And he had said he had done a lot of house flipping, and he's like, look, I got this house, and I'm going to give it to you. You just have to help me fix it up and everything, because I really want you to be someone who doesn't need to be worried. Which is funny. I've met a lot of people in my travels who have said this about me. They're like, you're not somebody who should be worried about making money. Your life would be much better if you don't have to do that. So he had said, I'm going to give you this house, and you just have to work on it really hardly with me and fix it up so that you can rent it out, and then you'll always have a source of income and a place to come home to that's yours. But of course that never happened. I later learned that he's just one of those guys who constantly says things that he doesn't do. Oops. He still does to this day. When I'm in touch with him, he just constantly says I'm going to do something. He never does it. And I took all of my most precious possessions from Leo's cabin, put them in this van, and drove across the country. And then after he visited me in New York, I parked my van on Dominic Street in downtown Manhattan and went to my first ever gay pride parade in New York, and my van got broken into and all my most precious possessions got stolen. So I was a little heartbroken after that and decided not to go back to Europe because I just felt stupid. And I decided I was going to go live with Leo. And I was like, maybe we can just be partners because I love him so much and I admire him so much. And maybe we can be partners. So I decided to do that. And I went to go live with him in the mountains of Northern California with this idea that his trust fund was running out. So we had to come up with some way of making money. And I thought, oh, maybe we can he thought of this idea, we could turn his cabin into a bed and breakfast because I used to like fasting for 2 weeks every year, so I had suggested that he fast with me, and so we did a 2-week fast together while some friends I knew from Europe came to visit, and we did a really good job of hosting them, of him like cooking a big meal and me entertaining them and us just having a really good time, like working together as a team. So he thought, would you like that, like operating the cabin together as a hermitage, or as a bed and breakfast, which of course this was in the days before Airbnb, which, it would just make it so much easier. But when I went out there to try to live with him, I noticed immediately that I had mostly been in the house on my own. Most of the time I'd spent in the house had been on my own, and I felt like it was my house, and I liked to live in it in a certain way. And he obviously had been a hermit there for about 20 years at this point. No, 15, something. He'd been a hermit there for like 15 years. And he was like, you have to do this. You can't do that. You have to stop doing this. You have to do things like that. And I was like, oh, I don't do well with being told what to do, how to live and how to be. That's not. So I left because that's what I knew how to do. And my mother wanted to go to Brazil and see the spiritual healer, and my dad paid for the trip. So I had a reason to leave. And then I was gone for like 3 months. And when I came back, Leo had made other plans. He ended up becoming an interim pastor through the church in a community out on the coast, so that I could live in the house and he would live out on the coast. So that was kind of interesting. That happened over the next few years. And the first place he lived was Fort Bragg, and he loved living there, and it was so nice to go visit him because it was in the redwoods, and on the ocean, so it was beautiful redwoods. He lived in a crappy little apartment in Fort Bragg, but it was fine. It was nice to visit him there. But when he'd come back to the house, he would constantly be doing that, like, you can't do this, and why isn't like this, and clean it better or something. He was just telling me that I couldn't be the way I wanted to be in the house. Like, oh, don't walk around naked where people could see you. You have to, it was just that all the time. There was no people around that could see me, so it just felt to me like it was a control thing, and I respond badly to that, especially then. So I decided to try to make my own life as opposed to live in somebody else's life, and decided I was going to go live in San Francisco. And that way I could still be close to Leo and still have a good life with Leo, but I would be making my own money and maybe developing a community of people my own age, because all the years I had spent up at his cabin in the woods, the neighbors were either old people who had no interest in me, or I had no interest in them, or meth heads and alcoholics. And weird hill people, he would call them the hill people, who just really wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to socialize. So that was kind of like not suitable for me. I'm a bit of a social person. This was before social media, where I could have just made all of this a video game. And his internet up there was like a crappy old copper wire, very slow. So I decided I was going to go live in San Francisco. And a few weeks, it was a month of staying with friends and looking for apartments drove me nuts, because I wasn't used to the way Californians operate. San Franciscans just being like, I told you I'd be there at 8, but sorry, I already rented it to someone. I forgot to tell you. It was just that kind of thing. And I was like, oh God. And a friend that I knew from the massage school invited me to go be her roommate in New York. So I went to New York, and I got hell-bent on trying to be independent, and decided I was going to make a life for myself, be an artist, and write a book or something. But after trying to do that in New York for like 11 months, I decided to leave and Leo wanted to go back to Europe together, so we went back to Europe for a couple weeks or 3 weeks or something and traveled around. It was very fun. That was right when I found out I had got HIV, so I was kind of a mess. He was very compassionate and very loving, and again, as travelers, we traveled so well together. I think when I came back from Europe... Oh no, he met me at the end of my trip in Europe. Then I came back for my brother's wedding. Tried to live in Tennessee. That didn't work out so well either. Somebody I loved that couldn't live with. Loving people and not being able to live with them. Still took I took a road trip with Leo up the coast, California to Oregon and back again. It was kind of fast. A shitty car. We were angry at each other, but it was beautiful. And after I moved to New York again, I had spent a little time in Hawaii, so I suggested we go to Hawaii, and we stayed at some of the people I had met, went out to Hawaii. That was nice to travel with him and kind of give him that he'd never had that experience. But I became kind of allergic to him. I mean, I loved cuddling with him, but I couldn't really have sex with him anymore. It made me sick, actually. It was weird. But that's when he was getting sick, and he'd never gone to doctors. He'd never got sick. He never got sick. He never went to doctors. And so when he started getting sick, it was just kind of weird. He'd get a flu, and it would last for a week, and he'd be like, "Oh, that's weird. There's a flu going around." But then it started happening a few times a year, and then when I was working at the acupuncture clinic here in the city, I met a girl who had she'd had hepatitis as well, and she'd been an alcoholic and a heroin addict, and she had said that she was describing her symptoms of having cirrhosis, and it was exactly what he was experiencing. So I called him and I was like, maybe you have cirrhosis. You might want to go check your liver, because that could be what's happening. You might need to do something about that. You know, I was kind of innocent about that thing. I'm working in an acupuncture clinic. There's solutions, or mitigations at least. But he found out he had cancer, and then it might be liver cancer, and then that was like, oh, death sentence. But then he found out that it's not liver cancer. It was a stage 4 metastasized, weird, rare, near islet cell pancreatic carcinoma that isn't really pancreatic cancer, but it spreads through the endocrine system, and it was everywhere, all over his body already. And the doctor said, well, lucky thing about this type of cancer is you can live with it for 20 years without it killing you. Bad news for you is you probably had it for 20 years already, and you've got about 3 months to live. So he went to Europe one last time with some friends of his, and he was he had been getting sick every other month at this point. He'd get sick for a week or two at a time, like a flu type sickness. It was really intense, overwhelming. So he went to Europe for 2 weeks, and I helped him arrange the trip, but he was going from people to people to people he knew in Europe. He stopped by New York, I think, before the trip, and spent a week or two with me here in New York. A week. And then when the doctors gave him the pronouncement that he had 3 months left to live, I had been doing this project where I wasn't going to leave New York for a year, and I succeeded in not leaving New York for a year for more than one night at a time. I was not away from my bed for more than one night at a time. That was nice. And then I went out there to be with him, because he'd always said to me, and again, in a joking but serious kind of way, because as a priest he had helped so many, as a priest and as a gay man and as a hospice worker, he had helped so many people die, that he would say to me, he'd be like, if I ever get anything chronic like cancer or something that's going to kill me, do me a favor and put me out of my misery, because it's horrible what people go through. And I was like, I got your back, buddy, I promise. So when they said he had 3 months left to live, I was like, so Leo, I've been doing some research, on how I can kill you. And he was like, well, I don't know about that. And when I went out to stay with him, I was like, so here are these herbs I got together, and there's some herbs that grow in the nature here. There was mistletoe all over the place. You can make a strong tea of that a couple times, and it dissolves your blood vessels. You die. And he was like, yeah, I don't know about that. And I was like, well, I could also suffocate you while you're sleeping, or we could, helium, I've heard. And he was like, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. And I'm like, look, you've been saying this to me for years. Are you sure you're backing out now? And he decided he wanted to go through the process with it. But death is a confusing and scary thing, and I think that that's one of the things that really shook me in my relationship with him, was that I had always seen him as someone with such a strong spiritual foundation. And if religion has any practical purpose whatsoever besides society, controlling or organizing society, it's about, relating to death, right? So I thought because he had such a good relationship with his God and with his practice, he had a discipline. He wasn't somebody who just went to church on Christmas or something, or even just once a week. He did it twice a day. That I was like, well, he'll be fine. And he had sworn he wasn't going to do chemo or anything, and then he did chemo for once, just once. And I was like, why did you do it? And he was like, oh, his ex-partner, because his partner had broken up with him because he had given him an ultimatum of, well, either you have me or Dominic. You can't still see him. And Leo was like, I don't know, because Leo also didn't obviously work well with people telling him how he had to live his life. So they broke up and didn't see each other for many years. But when he started dying, his ex-partner got back in touch with him and convinced him to do chemo. Was taking him to the doctors. And I was just like, oh. And then when I went out there, I was like, okay, so here are all these ways I can help you die. And he's like, no, I don't want you to help me die. And I was like, okay, well, if you don't want to die, then there's all these other ways that you could at least not feel so sick. And he was like, oh, I don't want you to try to make me well either. And I was like, what am I supposed to do? And, I'm a masseur. And part of what was happening with him, his skin felt like razor blades inside, not when I touched him, but if he were touched by anything, it was crystallizing inside because his body wasn't detoxing properly. So it felt like burning sandpaper or razor blades or something when I touched him. So I couldn't even touch him. I couldn't try to make him feel better, and I couldn't kill him. He wasn't cooperating on any of those levels. What I could do was help him sort through his past, empty out all of the stuff that we accumulate throughout life and take it to the thrift store or throw it away. We threw away tons of trash. We sorted through tons of photos and letters and books and got rid of tons of clothes. But ultimately, I didn't know what to do. And again, I had this fear because he had taken care of this man for 8 years. And taking care of that man for 8 years, he had learned how to cook really well, and he had gotten a trust fund that supported him for 25 years. Whereas Leo, had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience and wasn't going to leave me any trust fund. And I was like, I'm trying to build a life for myself where I can actually be independent in New York. So I felt like it was really a bad idea for me to just give up everything in New York and go and live with him for an indeterminate amount of time until he died. And I felt terribly, heartbrokenly guilty for that. To leave him while he was dying. But then my health started deteriorating. I was HIV positive and trying not to be on meds because I was a nature hippie. And I started getting opportunistic infections and my T cells dropped, so I went back to New York. He dismissed me, and I got on meds. And then again, like I said, as he started taking more painkillers and weird things to mitigate the dying process, he became more angry and bitter. And he would, when I would talk to him, he'd just be like, oh, the world's a terrible place and the people are horrible and I think everything's going to hell. And he never used to talk like that. And I was like, what is going on? And he would just sit there all day in his chair, nodding out on the junkie nod, listening to NPR. And, of course, if you listen to the news all the time, you think the world we're living in is hell. The news is like a nightmare show all the time. It didn't used to be what he did. He used to be a hedonist, but he could no longer be a hedonist because he was dying. Nothing felt good anymore. He couldn't eat without getting sick. He couldn't drink without getting sick. I made him, because he had a lot of pot farmers around him, they gave me tons of marijuana, and I made him lots of marijuana bonbons that he would eat every night to help him sleep. And I then felt guilty a few years later, realizing that might have been what kept him alive so long, because cannabis is incredibly anti-cancerous. And I was like, oh no, maybe that's what kept, I don't know, you couldn't win for losing. But foolishly, when he started getting angry and he started to get kind of abusive, he went through a few caretakers and he would scream at them and terrify them and they'd leave. And much like the George DeBat story that he stepped into, I felt like he was really attached to me, and that was one of the things that was holding him here, was that he really wanted me to be well. He wanted me to be safe. He wanted me to be happy. So I thought, well, if I make him not care about me, then he won't be attached to me, and then he'll be free to leave. Which was logic, and logic is not always the best technique, and certainly not in matters like that, and it was not a well thought out logic. So so unfortunately our relationship kind of dissolved at some point when he was being kind of abusive and aggressive to me on the phone, and I was like, you know what, Leo, I just don't want to talk to you anymore. Which is weird, because we used to talk for an hour every week. For like years, we'd talk on the phone for an hour every week, and it just got to the point where he was taking out his sadness and aggression on me, and I didn't have the confidence, I didn't have the groundedness, I didn't have the compassion to let him without taking it personally. It hurt too much. So we didn't speak for a few years, and I had this premonition that the rest of the stuff that I left there he was starting to throw away, and I decided I should go out there and get it. And he made it very clear that he didn't really want to spend time with me, and I didn't really want to spend time with him. So we arranged it so I would go out there and get the rest of my stuff while he was down at Harbin. And it felt so weird to be there kind of with him and not talking to him, and then he left, and then he came back, and fortunately we got to like hug, and I got to say thank you. So even though there was a bad feeling between us, I got to hug and say thank you. And we didn't speak for a few years, but when I walked across Spain, I had been to Spain with him in 2006 to Santiago de Compostela. We'd gone there on the train, and to me it just seemed like some silly Catholic circus thing that didn't mean anything. But when I walked across Spain, it felt really amazing to go there, and it was really great to like be able to use some of his Christian magic for him, to be able to pray for him or dedicate some of the pilgrimage to him. And I think he really felt that. And when I got back from Spain, we had a really great conversation on the phone, and he died a few months later, on January 23rd, 2015. And it was funny because on that day I met somebody that I'd been talking to online, but I met in person for the first time, who had the same birthday as him and was the exact same age that he was when I met him. So I decided to fall in love with that guy, because I was like, oh, this is like, a gift from Leo or something. Didn't turn out that way at all, but that's okay. And I felt a lot, it took a while for the guilt and the sadness to abate, dissipate. And somebody I had I met last year, who was an avid reader. And I still write a lot, but I don't put it all out on the internet. So I sent him a bunch of my writing, and he was just like, you talk about this guy Leo, I want to know more about him. And I really got to thinking, when I was friends with Leo and I spent a lot of time with him, I just thought he was one of the most fascinating people in the world. I mean, his life stories and the way he lived. Somebody at the beginning of this chat was like, oh, you'll find there are 1,000 other Leos out there waiting for you. Then why the fuck haven't I met them? I've never met anybody else who was like Leo. There was not an ounce of jealousy in him. I mean, I had a relationship with him unlike anyone else in that, to a certain degree, he encouraged me to be spiritual and encouraged me to be a hedonist. I loved that there was like a real intimate love and understanding and intellectuality, a physicality that was completely non-possessive. He possessed his space and he possessed his stuff, his icons and his chasubles, his vestments, his chalices, and all of his weird Christian paraphernalia like that. He had the Taurus possession thing going on hardcore about his house. But even though poverty, chastity, and obedience, none of it actually belonged to him. It all belonged to the church. But he still had a control issue about it. But he never had that with me. And I just found it so inspiring that we could each have sex with different people and talk to each other about that with just joy about celebrating and sharing that. And all the boyfriends I've had since then have been really jealous and weird about that, which is a normal human thing, really. I'm even more jealous and controlling than he was. So he was a really good. Again, one of the things I appreciate about him so much was that he just lived by example so well. He wasn't a preacher, even though he was a preacher. He wasn't telling people how to live their life. He was just very set a good example. But again, I wasn't one of his congregation. I don't know what he was like in church. I didn't like going to church. But yeah, he really, really enriched my life. So when I started off earlier, I was describing him as being so rich. He never had a lot of money, but he was just so rich. All the things he knew and the way he enjoyed life was just so wonderful. And the freedom he had with his body and his heart and his mind. Until he was dying. And I felt really relieved when he died because he'd just been suffering so much. I was so grateful that he finally died. But it really set me on this tear. My friend Kos died a week after Leo. I met Kos when I came back to New York. Between the two times, I'd spent a lot of time out there with Leo dying at the end of 2010 and 2011. Beginning of 2011, I met Kos that winter, and Kos was like, "Oh, who is this stupid man you're going to visit?" Kos was just so harsh about all that, but he was like, "That guy's not dying. He's gonna live longer than I live." So when Kos was in the hospice and totally out of his mind on morphine, and Leo died, I was like, "Hey, Kos, I just wanted to let you know that you were actually wrong. Leo did actually die before you, even though it's just a few days before you're gonna die." And he didn't understand me because he was out of his mind. But that's fine. What a horrible thing. But both Kos and Leo had both given me a very clear way of how they were going to die. They both were very confident and certain about how they were going to die. And neither of them ended up dying that way. And it was very... I didn't go through the great gay plague of watching all your friends die. Both of my parents are still alive. And I wasn't with my grandparents when they were dying. So I don't know what the dying process is actually like very much, except with these two father figure lovers that I've had. They both died of cancer. And Leo died at 67 and started dying at 63, I think, or 62. I mean, that's pretty young, I think. That's when my grandfather died, and my mother's father died at 56 or something, and my father's mother died at 58, I think, and my mother's mother died at 72. So that's one of the reasons I lived the life I've lived, just while I'm retiring at the age of 14 or something, because I'm like, why work a job that I hate to support a family that I resent, to then retire and enjoy my life, but only die of a heart attack, stroke, or cancer. That was a big thing that fueled me to live the life I've lived. So it was very interesting to see Leo being someone who constantly said he had no regrets and was very clear about his relationship with death, and then his dying process became not that. And Kos being so, just his sheer stubbornness and grouchiness being, this isn't about Kos, but regardless, neither of them set a good example of a peaceful, graceful dying process, and it scared me into learning how to die properly, which I really worked on in my early 20s. That was actually a big focus of my life, starting at the age of like 16 or 15. Maybe 15 is when I first got obsessed with death and tried to figure out how to die properly, which is what I think of as my shamanistic initiation. Of the whole, I don't call myself a shaman, but people sometimes do. But as a 20-year-old, I thought it was like that's what I was learning how to do, was to be a shaman. And I felt like to be a shaman, you had to be someone who could die at any moment. And really, to be a shaman, you had to be someone who could die and come back. That's what I thought being a shaman meant. And to be able to die and come back, you have to have the skill and the articulation and the presence to be able to die and come back, have the presence of being with the dying process, so you can flip into the other realms, because there's not just one. There's not just one place we're going. There's lots and lots of, many places, as many intersections as there are in New York City. As many intersections as there are in all the cities together in the world, out there in Deathland. So I guess in life and in death, Leo inspired me, positively and negatively. And again, I have this friend Tony now, who I've known since 2004. And Tony's not dead. And he's dying just as much as the rest of us are dying, but he's not dying in an ostensible way, an acute way. He's not dying acutely. He's living very well. And I found Tony's life to be pretty inspiring, especially the way he's aged. He's not as boastful as Kos or Leo. Maybe he is, but not in the same way. But he, motherfucker at the age of 68 walked 600 miles across Spain, or like 550 or whatever he did. But I mean, it was just like I don't know. Nobody, my mother walked with us, but she was only 60. She turned 65 on that thing. But Leo died before he reached 68. And Kos certainly wouldn't have done anything. Like, that's just something I really admire, and again, like, Tony's incredibly different than Leo, and he's astrologically a Leo, so there's me back with my old fate again. But that he lives his life in a very engaging way. Like, he remains interested and engaging. He absorbs, he enjoys, he teaches. They're not similar in many ways, but they're both inspiring in that way. Anyway, as I was saying earlier, I used to think Leo was just so fascinating and so unique, and I'm still somewhat in shock about his death, and I know that when he and Kos died, I was terrified of ever loving an old man again, because I was like, you're just going to die of cancer. I was terrified, you're just going to die of cancer. We're all going to die of cancer. Oh my God. And it's weird in that like, I'm kind of terrified of alcohol nowadays and marijuana, any of the inebriants. I'm just like, oh, that's just a bad idea. It's a delusion. It's a waste of time. And like, even sex, like, for many years when Leo was doing his dying process, sex became a part of illness for me. So like, his dying process, like, all of the gifts of freedom he gave me, all became toxic while he was dying. And so that was really interesting. I mean, the way I took it personally, the way I internalized it, that I'm still recovering from. I love at the beginning of this, somebody was like, just get over it, or something. He was trying in his Spanish way to tell me, get over it. There was some kind of talk I went to. Oh, it was Chip, Samuel Delaney, who's 75 now. Was it him? No, it wasn't him. Maybe it was Joseph Goldstein, who's 76 or 78 now. Who was it? Somebody was like, I don't think we ever get over anything. Oh, it was Ajahn Suchito, this Buddhist teacher at the last meditation retreat. He was like, I don't think we ever get over anything. We don't ever get over anything. We learn how to be with it in a better way. But it's always there. Once you've had it in your life, it's always there. Which is a very weird thing for a Buddhist to say, especially somebody who's devoted their lives to being a Buddhist monk. The motherfucker has renounced everything. I mean, like, Theravada monks, like, they can't even touch money or food. It has to be fed, it has to be given to them in a bowl. Like, they can't even pick up food. They have to be given to that. So, I mean, like, pretty intense. We don't ever get over anything. And Buddhists have an idea, you don't even have a self. So I just thought that was really intense when he said that. But it is, I don't think I ever get over anything. But we grow, we move on, we learn better ways of being with what we have and what we are. So I keep trying to get back to this, that I was terrified. I think Leo was the most fascinating person, right? When I was alive, the stories he would tell, when he was alive, the stories he would tell, it always made me want to write a book. I always imagined writing this book of Leo, of all these stories he told. When he was dying, I would try to interview him and make all these audio recordings. So I made lots of audio recordings, but I've never listened to them. I don't know if I ever will. And that's kind of what today was about. Today is the book of Leo. I had some big desire a couple weeks ago where I was like, let me see if I can finish writing Leo's I, Leo. Let me see if I can finish writing it and like tell all of his stories, and I can't. So I thought maybe I could just story tell it. Maybe I could just talk for a while. And that's worked fine. I feel this has adequately done what I could do to tell more of Leo's story, his fascinating story, and then it all just becomes about me because he's dead, and what do I have left is my relationship with him and my memories of him and the way he made me feel and the things I learned from him and the ways he affected me. When I was looking through pictures today, this morning, after saying happy birthday Leo, I started looking through pictures, and I was specifically looking for one, and I couldn't find it. Now I know where it is, so I can post it when I'm done. I'll post some more pictures when I'm done with this video. I started looking through Facebook. One of the things people always made fun of me about, and still do sometimes, lightly, is that all the men I love look the same. And I'm like, no, they don't. They look very different. And then I was looking through Facebook, and I was like, all the men I love look the same. They're all just these, like, chubby, white-bearded guys. Oh, no. Like, the mystery and the fascinating world yeah, well, Urso, maybe I can... Well, I don't know if I can just post his recordings online. I don't know if that's a good idea. But maybe I could, put some up for you somewhere. I made a lot of them, though. But yeah, it's so funny now that I have such a different relationship with inebriants, such a different relationship with sex, and such a different relationship with old men than I did when I was at the height of my pleasure seeking with Leo, that I don't know how I would ever feel so fascinated by someone's life ever again. And this guy who had said, "Oh, I want to hear all about Leo," when I wrote this long story about this guy I went to visit in Hawaii last year, trying to talk about love and the lack of love and what love means and the difficulty of love and the struggle of love. And he was like, when he read it, he said, "Oh, your idea of love is so tedious and boring. It's all based on sexual need." And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? And it's true that people only can see what they can see. So I don't know if he was true about that. But when we talked about it further, I mean, I don't know if he was correct about that. But when we talked about it further, he said, you constantly describe what it's like when you don't have love. You very articulately express what it feels like when there isn't love between you and another person. But you don't talk about what it's like to love someone. You just talk about sex and pleasure. And I was like, isn't that a way of expressing love? And then I was like, well, is that? Yeah. The concept of future seems so different. There is no future. There is only right now and our ability to be with it in a good way without being lost in the past or anxieties of fantasy futures. So it really got me thinking of when Leo was alive and I was blogging, I would often complain about Leo, about feeling annoyed by him and how imperfect a lover he was. how he drank too much or ate too much, how he was a glutton or whatever. I would complain. I remember that. I remember, and I know that I've really trained myself to articulate my dissatisfaction with the world. It was a choice that I made as a teenager. The world was very dissatisfying, and I wanted to articulate it clearly. I don't know how useful that would be, but I tried. I worked really hard at it. Made a lot of art pieces about it. I don't know what to say about that or so. A dialogue between the past and the future. Isn't that why people have kids? That's what we do with our whole lives. That's what we're doing right now. So anyway, this guy asked me, like, he said he wanted to know more about Leo, and he had complained that I didn't articulate what love was like, what loving was like. So part of my impulse for today, and from that, I've been really inspired by that conversation with that guy, the criticism. Was like showing the act of loving, appreciation, articulating the act of appreciation, the experience of loving, and making people feel more loved. Some people do it by cooking you dinner, or some people do it by giving you a massage. How do you maintain focus on the expression, the act, the engagement of loving, especially when you're habituated and trained to adequately articulate your disappointment? We're always going to have disappointment. But it's still become an interesting project for me to articulate the experience of loving more. And I know that one of the things that was so frustrating for me when I went out there to be with Leo was that I couldn't kill him. I couldn't do like an act of love to put him out of his mercy. I couldn't give him a massage. I couldn't cook for him. He didn't like my food. I couldn't do anything to show love for him except be there. And that I couldn't do very well. I've never been very good at just being there. I was like I was pushed into a corner and made to feel totally useless, which was amazing because I had a terrible, arrogant confidence at that point, and it shattered it. I don't know if that's a gift he gave me. I think it probably is. It hasn't been pleasant, but it probably helped get me real. Anyway, I love you, Leo. Happy 70th birthday. I don't know if I'm sorry you didn't make it to be 70. I guess you're still kind of alive. I was posting, one of my other friends from San Francisco sent me pictures he took of Leo. Or so you know him, Plumpy. Sent me pictures he took of Leo. Maybe I'll post some of those when I post the other pictures of Leo after I'm done with this. And Leo was never much of a technologically minded person. He didn't really care about electronics very much. But he started his dying process before Facebook became a huge thing. He had no interest in a smartphone. So he was never in social media. There's not tons of pictures of Leo's floating around out there on the internet. If you go to his Facebook page, Remembering Leo, there's, again, most of these people from his church commenting on it. And he almost never, I don't think he ever posted anything on it himself. His church people post things on it. When I did a search of Seeing Your Friendship on Facebook, he commented on one thing I did for my 33rd birthday, which is when I was out there trying to help him die, and he said, your first 33 years have been quite a ride. I wonder what you're going to do for your second act. I wonder. But that was all he ever commented on my Facebook. He didn't use it very much. So I don't know. It was been nice to spend time with him today, putting him out there on social media a bit, and it's not as good as being hugged by him or sleeping on a bed under the stars in the mountains of Northern California, or going to a hot springs with him that has burned the year he died. The hot springs a half hour away from his house, which had buildings that were like 100 years old, burned down in a huge forest fire. His house didn't burn down though. But I don't yearn for him or pine for him or desire him. Even looking at pictures, it doesn't like hurt my heart. I do often wish that I could talk with him again though, and that I could go visit him, and that I could go travel with him. I miss him existing as a friend, a loving friend, a companion, intermittent as it may have been. His partner, again, who he had been with for like 9 or 8 years when I met him, and then they broke up. It was so odd. His partner was like 10 years younger than him, or maybe older, young, or maybe even wider separation than that. And his partner found out he had cancer shortly after Leo started his dying process. Like in 2011, his partner found out he had cancer. And I think he tried to do chemo or surgery or something, but it had already spread, and he ended up dying a few months after Leo died, and I was just totally shocked by that. One of my paranoid delusions or fears or whatever was that Leo was so used to everyone he loved dying from the AIDS years that he just expected me to die, and I felt like it was an existential weight I had to fight against. And so I thought it was so weirdly, terrifyingly validating that his longest term partner as an adult died right after he died. Like, they didn't die together, everyone dies alone. But they went through this whole dying process together. As I separated from Leo, he got much more back in touch with this guy, and they talked about their dying of cancer together, and they both ended up dying within a few months of each other. Fate, soulmates, who knows? Relationships. But I'm grateful I got to share some of this life with him. At the age of 20, what was it, 22, I think? From the age of 22, I shaved my head when I was 23. So the age of 22 to 35 at least. He died when I was 36, I guess. 37, 36. Anyway. Thank you, Leo, and all who knew him, and all who loved him, and all who were loved by him, and the many who were touched by him, and the many who were inspired by him.